part of this class is that from class to class, if you have questions and I don't know the answer, which is probably going to happen, I'm going to try to do some research and I will try to get answers to you by the next class. For some of these answers, the answer is nobody knows. There are random explanations that try to explain, that attempt to figure out what historical need was being met with something occurring, but nobody has any idea what the real answer is for much of this liturgical development, because there are just missing fragments of that development. All right, I guess we're getting started because I'm talking already. Here we go. Okay, so welcome everybody. It's really good to see many familiar faces, a bunch of unfamiliar faces. Obviously with COVID, I have not met as many people as I would like to have met, and looking forward to spending more time with all of you in these group sessions, individually, etc. This is going to be, for the moment at least, a 3-part series about Jewish liturgy. There is an absurd amount of stuff to cover, and there is no way that we can even cover the minimum amount of stuff that I'd like to in this 3-part session. So I do want to know what you are interested in, and that's the point of I need you to ask questions because I want to answer most of your questions. There was a prompt from Monica at the beginning when you were signing up, what questions you might have for me. I did look through those, but I only looked through them today because I didn't realize that existed. So I sort of planned out what today was going to be, but I think I might try to stick a little 5-minute segment on the end and just quick answer a couple of the questions that people asked, and we'll do that each session, and hopefully that will cover some of the questions that people have. All right, right. This class originally was intended to be sort of a deep dive on each session would be a deep dive on 2 prayers, basically. Eventually, I decided that probably wasn't the right fit for this community yet, at least, that we need to talk some more broad liturgical patterns before we can get into the details. Next session, we will actually go a little bit more in detail, and there will be actually image sharing from me to try to guide you through some more the rubrics of prayer, basically, in each service. But for this time, I'm just speaking to you. There's no imagery going on, or there will be no screen sharing going on or that kind of thing. Sorry, just going through all the introductory stuff. One of the difficulties of this class is there is such a wide range of knowledge among all of you that there's going to be a little repetition for some people who know more. And one of the other difficulties is every time I try to explain one thing, especially for people who have a lower exposure level to Jewish history and liturgy, etc., is that every time I bring up one thing, it's going to raise 5 more questions. So this is very difficult, and we will try to be as thorough as we can here. Okay, so today we're going to go over a little bit of structural, what services exist in a normal week, let's say, of just daily living. I'm not going to get into festivals. I'm not getting into high holidays at all in this series yet. Maybe in the future we'll add on a little bit of high holiday material. But we're really just talking about daily prayer. Here and there, I'm going to do a little section of just terminology that will be useful to you in living your life Jewishly. And if you wanted to do any further reading on liturgy, some terms that might be helpful in fully understanding all of that material that you might encounter. We're going to cover some specific liturgy, not really in today's class, but in next time and the time after, we're going to cover the most essential prayers, basically. Next time, we're going to do Shema, Uvirchotecha, meaning Shema, and the blessings that surround it, and the Amidah, the Tefillah. Those are the 2 core components of any service, basically. There are a couple of exceptions to that where the Shema is not actually in the service, and it's only an Amidah. This is a good place to start. Basically, every service that we have has an Amidah component into it. Amidah meaning literally standing, and Tefillah, the other term for the Amidah, meaning prayer. Amidah and Tefillah, interchangeable terms in this context. Obviously, those words have meanings, and if you use them in Hebrew in you know, you're speaking Hebrew, they would have separate meanings outside of the liturgical context. Every service has an Amidah, and the purpose of that is that it comes from the development of rabbinic Judaism. So when the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 CE, you know, sacrifice was basically, the rabbis and the Jewish leaders decided sacrifice is no longer, basically. And the rabbis were going to take over, and prayer had to substitute for these sacrifices. So every service is a substitute, basically, for an offering that was made at the Great Temple. Now, that is not definitively how the rabbis see, if in the modern context, if I were talking about where did Shacharit come from, the morning service, there would be two explanations. There is the morning sacrifice at the Great Temple. There is also a separate explanation that we'll get into in a minute when I go through each of the different types of services. Let me just make sure I'm getting through all my material before we get to that point. Okay, so let's define first the term liturgy. That might be a good idea, a good place to start. So, does anybody want to chime in? What do you think liturgy means? Like, obviously, it's not used very much outside of the context that we use it in right now. And in a modern sense, it doesn't really mean anything else than what you would think it means. Does anybody have any ideas of where it came from, or just what you think of when you hear the word? Yes, Marilyn.
The order of our prayers.
Sure, great. Anybody else? Okay, so no pressure to chime in. Okay, so the term liturgy itself is not Hebrew, obviously, and it comes from the Latin liturgia. I don't speak Latin, so if that could be a terrible pronunciation. Also, nobody really speaks Latin, so who cares? But liturgia, which means a public service, and not service as in synagogue service or, you know, church or anything, just anything that is for the good of the public. So in ancient times, yes, the greatest service for the public was worship of the gods, was service to the gods or the god or whatever culture we're talking about, that how singular or plural of gods. But it was as simple as that. That's where the term comes from. Now, of course, in our context and what we're dealing with today, it's mostly what Marilyn said. Just any custom that has to do with that service in the context of a religious service. Basically, the words. I mean, that's when I think of liturgy, I'm thinking of the words. How do we organize these words? Exactly what Marilyn said. The order, maybe what choreography goes with those words. We're going to cover a little bit of that today because that was the most commonly asked question. When do I do these bows? Why am I doing these bows? The whys are harder to answer because the reality is I have no idea where this actually originated. We don't really know. That's like it's all minhag. There's no rabbinic law. There's no halacha. The word for like rabbinic law is halacha. There is no law of when to do those things. That's not part of the equation in terms of observing commandments. Now, a rabbi still in an Orthodox setting might correct what you're doing and when you bow and all that, but it's not law. That's minhag. So every tradition across the world is probably going to have a different version of what you've experienced. And even when you're watching me, I have a couple of things that I picked up in seminary that are not particularly traditional, and I'll go over that when we get to the choreography section. Okay. We're going to be looking at prayer practice, mostly the text, but we will touch on the choreography, as I said. And at the end of today's class, I'm going to just do a little choreography section of everything that I can think of in a normal prayer service. There is additional stuff for the high holidays that we could cover, and for festivals. But for the most part, I'm just going to cover what we would do in a Shabbat service, or the Shabbat 2 services, Friday and Saturday. All right, so before we get to the prayer layout, I just wanted to talk about 2 terms that I think are very important when discussing liturgy and its development historically. You may have heard these before, maybe not. The 2 terms are keva and kavana. So keva is structure, it's fixity, it's the rigidity of prayer. And it doesn't pertain specifically to prayer, but it's usually used in that context. And kavana is your internal intention, your devotion, just like the feelings in your heart that might be inspiring that prayer. So Abraham Joshua Heschel, the famous theologian and scholar from the mostly early 20th century into the mid 20th century, described the balance between keva and kavana as the fixity of our prayer book and the spontaneity of our heart. And they need to be balanced with each other. There is a specific difficulty in Jewish prayer that there are laws of how to pray, when to pray, what to say. And there are fixed times that you would pray, fixed ways in which you're supposed to pray. And that's more minhag, as I was saying, the minhag meaning custom, fixed texts. And on the other hand, prayer is really supposed to be coming from your heart, right? It's the outpouring of the soul. That's how the rabbis would generally describe it. It's a matter of kavanah, of inner devotion. And thus Jewish prayer is guided by these sort of two opposite principles. You have order and outburst. You have regularity and spontaneity, uniformity and individuality, law, freedom, duty, prerogative, empathy, self-expression, insight, sensitivity, creed, faith. You kind of have all of these different opposites, and they need to be, those are the two things that are sort of at war with each other in prayer. Maybe that's a terrible term there, but they are in conflict with each other. So Maimonides, the great rabbi, if anybody doesn't know who Maimonides is, this is a fair point. This is what I was saying about it, spawning many questions for people who don't have as much experience with, with anything from the 12th century, which should be plenty of people. There was a man named Moses ben Maimon, and he is maybe beside Rabbi Hillel, the greatest rabbinical figure, but he's certainly the greatest rabbi of his era. And we will actually talk a little bit about rabbinic history because that's very confusing to many people. And especially if you're observing an Orthodox anything, like they're going to be reading Gemara, they're reading the Talmud. You may have no idea what those terms mean. When we go through the history of rabbinic thought next time, it's not going to be that detailed. I'm just sort of giving you like the eras. That will be part of that. So in the 12th century, a man named Moses ben Maimon was born in Spain, in Cordoba, and he eventually moved to Alexandria, and he was the chief, really, doctor for the pharaoh or the king of Egypt. I don't know what the proper term was for that regime. But he was the head rabbi of basically the whole Middle East, Northern Africa. Like, if people had questions that could not be answered by their regional rabbi, they sent them into this guy. He rewrote the Talmud, basically, the primary rabbinic text that took hundreds of years to compile. He basically said, those texts were all, it's kind of funny, there's no resolution to many of these arguments that the rabbis had in these rabbinic texts. It's just a compilation of all the different opinions. Maimonides, being as all-knowing and perhaps arrogant as he was, compiled all of those thoughts into one volume in which he gave the opinion that he agreed with for every single one and said, you follow my opinion. And then honestly, that has led to some degree in modern times to the reason that Orthodoxy is as static as it is. I don't want to say that it's all his fault. It's not. He was like a great thinker, and he, as much as he made a mistake in that regard, in my opinion, he was someone who believed that people should have choice in how they do things, and he was a very complex person. But okay, that we're maybe getting too much into Maimonides. But Maimonides said, in regard to kavanah and keva, prayer without kavanah is no prayer at all. He who has prayed without kavanah ought to pray once more. He whose thoughts are wandering or occupied with other things need not pray until he has recovered his mental composure. Hence, on returning from a journey, or if one is weary or distressed, it is forbidden to pray until his mind is composed. The sages said that upon returning from a journey, one should wait 3 days until he is rested and his mind is calm, and then he prays. That is not what an Orthodox Jew would tell you right now. I can guarantee you that. Or, okay, that's very generalizing everything to Orthodox Jews. There may be someone who would tell you that, but for the most part, like, it is your duty to pray 3 times a day, and you will do that. So he's a real, like, outside the box thinker. He had many different opinions that people would not agree with. From all sides, from the left, from the right, from Orthodox, Reform, you know, he was his own person. Abraham Joshua Heschel said on a similar note, "How grateful I am to God that there is a duty to worship, a law to remind my distraught mind that it is time to think of God, time to disregard my ego for at least a moment. It is such happiness to belong to an order of the divine will. I'm not always in a mood to pray. I do not always have the vision and the strength to say a word in the presence of God. But when I am weak, it's the law that gives me strength. When my vision is dim, it's duty that gives me insight." And this battle between Kavanagh and Keva is one of the greatest challenges in the Reform world, specifically because most people don't know Hebrew, right? That's just a reality. Even if you know some, you're not understanding every word that you're saying. I don't understand every word that I'm saying. I mean, I know the vast majority of our prayers well, but especially if I were to go to an Orthodox service and participate there are going to be some things I'm not as familiar with, and I wouldn't know what I'm saying in every case. So this is the real battle. How can we have an outpouring of the heart with these fixed words? And we will talk a little bit next time about how there is a development from basically free prayer. There is a structure, you're supposed to pray about this topic, but you come up with the words. That's how prayer worked until the rabbis were like, no, it's too free. We need more keva, more of the structure in our prayer service, because people's minds are wandering all over the place while they're praying and they're not offering good prayers. You know, so there's this balance going on with the rabbis where they want people to be offering their heartfelt emotions, and at the same time, they need a little bit more structure. They need to be staying on the same page at the same time. Part of it is that they wanted the congregation to actually take the right amount of time to say each prayer so that they're all in the same place and they can end the service at the same time. But some people were taking 3 hours to pray and some people took 5 minutes, and that was a problem to them. I mean, obviously that's probably a little hyperbolic, but
Cantor?
Yes, question.
Hey, it's Billy.
Hi.
I actually I have a little bit of feedback on this.
Sure.
I know I feel like this kind of follows the Jewish teaching that it's more important to do than to feel. And so I know when I teach 5th grade, I'm saying, hey, you're learning these prayers. You probably don't have the Kavanah right now, but it's really important for you to learn it so that you're not worried about the words, you're just worried about your heart.
Great.
And there is a whole freestyle thing that we talk about. I call them freestyle prayers. And we talk about that. It's like, when do you do that? And they're, usually in a game before they're about to make the big shot. But I don't think there's necessarily a battle between the two. I feel like they go hand in hand at times, especially with the tenet that you do and then you feel.
Right. I mean, yes, that's certainly one way to look at it. And it's kind of accurate to how I've experienced it. So that's a great point. Right. In cantorial school, we're taught the prayers, but it takes some time for us to internalize what they mean to us individually and to actually learn, what the words really mean themselves, because you're just learning the Hebrew off the bat if you don't speak fluently. Yeah, that's a great point. Okay, so another caveat that I kind of didn't say at the beginning. Almost everything that we learn in cantorial school, and that almost every clergy person in the US falls into this little trap, is that our seminaries are almost entirely Ashkenazi. So everything that I'm saying is from that tradition. Now, of course, when we're talking about way back in time, Maimonides and earlier, that may not be true, because the distinctions either haven't been made yet. That's not the case with Maimonides. If we're going a little bit further back, those distinctions of tradition have not necessarily, the divergences have not necessarily occurred. But once we get into more modern history, I'm telling you what the tradition is in most Ashkenazi settings, let's say, but that may or may not be the case in a Sephardi or in a Mizrahi. Okay, so before we are going to get to the services and talk about those, but I did want to cover one more piece of terminology before we got there. And this is not exactly in the same sense, but you may notice, and this was one of the questions that I got a couple of times, that certain words are repeated many, many times in a service. One of those patterns being Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Now, from a literal standpoint, it can be translated quite easily, right? It's blessed is Adonai, blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, or something of that, king of the universe, if you want to be gendered in that regard. Okay, but I want us to take a look a little bit at what each of these words means, and the origins of those words, and why they might be repeated that many times. Now, the first thing, let's cover that last bit first, why they're repeated so many times. This is part of the rabbinic effort to homogenize prayer and to introduce at least a little bit of organization into the prayer structure. So there are two general types of prayers, a bracha ketzara and a bracha arucha, meaning one is like a short blessing and a long blessing. There are exceptions to this, and a little bit, there's more variation than that. But in general, those are the two types of blessings. One of them would just be Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri hagafen, right? That's ketzara, that's a short blessing. So you say the whole 6-word little phrase that we've been talking about, and then like the fruit or of the vine, or whatever the individual prayer would be. Just a very short little something, and they doesn't mean short doesn't actually mean that it's one sentence. It could be in a similar structure to that. But there are others in which you would do Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, have like 5 paragraphs of prayer, and then at the very end you would just have Baruch atah Adonai without the second half of that little rubric, and then the name of the prayer usually. If it's a longer prayer, that's where the name of the prayer is going to be. Baruch atah Adonai blank blank, like the one who makes holy the Shabbat, Mekadesh HaShabbat. So Mekadesh HaShabbat is not actually the name of the prayer there, so there are exceptions in terms of that naming method. But okay, so let's go through the individual words, because there is reason that this is there, and why the rabbis made this the structure that most prayers follow, at least. Baruch, first word in there. Now, in its most basic form, levarech, that's the infinitive, to bless. It means to bless, as we said. And in this context, it would mean, in Baruch, in that conjugation, it would be blessed is, and then the next word, blessed are you, God. But the root of the word actually comes from knees. It's a little strange. It's like, when I heard that, I was, huh? What's going on here? The root of the word, okay, so this is another thing where I might be bringing up more than I should. Every Hebrew word has a root. I mean, it's basically 3 consonants that make up the like bones, the structure of that word. Not everyone is 3 consonants, just to be clear. There are 2 and there are 4, but 4 is extremely rare and 2 is not that rare, but it's much less common than 3. And in this case, it would be bet, resh, and kaf chaf. Okay, so here, in this case, it means knee. And that's a case in which, if I were to say, what does this root mean to any modern Israeli, like every root, it means that every word that is associated with those 3 letters in that order would have a similar meaning, a related meaning. They may not mean the same thing. It might be to bless and a blessing and like all of the different variations of that kind of word. Some of them have nothing to do with each other. There are variations in which they have legitimately nothing to do with each other. And in this case, that would seem to be one. Knees, bless. But this is a case where bless is the more modern interpretation, of modern meaning 2,000 years old or 3,000 years old, version of something that actually did not mean that a long, long time ago. And the reason being, right, it originally was knees, and the way that you blessed anything that you blessed, you prayed to your God, was you bent your knees, right? So they just became sort of synonymous with each other And now I doubt that anybody's using the term for knees very often in comparison to the blessing version and definition of that word. So we've got that. And there's one unrelated definition in that family of words with that root that, which is bricha. And bricha means reservoir. And it's seemingly seemingly very different from all of the other words in this family pool. And so the rabbis came up with this little way of expanding the definition of Baruch in the context of this prayer so that it just makes it more meaningful and more holy. So when we bend our knees in front of our God, we are humbling ourselves. We're prostrating ourselves or supplicating ourselves, or whatever word we want to use there, before the God. And so the rabbis came up with this terminology. They said, we humble ourselves before you in your reservoir of life. So they're trying to use as many different versions of that root in this little phrase. Okay, the next word, atah, is more important to what the rabbis are actually doing here. Baruch, I'm sure in the context of prayer, existed far before the rabbis were in the equation. But using the word atah here in this little pattern that we use in almost all of our blessings implies that there is an intimate connection, atah meaning you, sorry. Atah means you. So blessed are you, our God. It implies that there's an intimate connection between the person who is praying and God. And this is kind of new because the rabbis, sorry, Billy, did you have something to say? Oh, sorry.
I was just thinking how cool this is. Like I don't know any of this. So roll on,
right.
Roll on, Cantor.
So at this point in time, this is entirely new to the population of the Israelites, of the Jews, in that they had to go to the temple, or maybe not the temple, but a temple, in order to offer some sort of sacrifice to connect with God. That was the way they connected with God. It really was the job of the Levites and the Kohanim to interact with God for us. But after the rabbis come into the equation and say, okay, now it's everybody's duty to pray, and sacrifice is no longer a thing that we need to be involved with, each person has to develop their own intimate connection with God. And the inclusion of atah is to emphasize that we are speaking directly to God, and there is no intermediary required in this occasion, not even the rabbis. The rabbis are not necessary here. In fact, this is a much later thing in time. This is almost 2,000 years ago. But in a writing that happened maybe about 1,000 years ago, they did say, if you had to choose between a rabbi and a cantor, choose a cantor because they will lead you in prayer. The rabbi is more for making, lifestyle decisions and like court-like decisions in terms of how you should live your life. But the rabbis would say that prayer itself is more important than someone to adjudicate all of these issues that you would have. Okay, so let's moving on. So the next word, we have Baruch atah, blessed are you. And then we have a Yud He Vav He. Now I'm assuming most of you know this, would read this as Adonai. Those are the 4 letters, Yud He Vav He. Would read that as Adonai, right? It is Adonai. For all intents and purposes, that is Adonai. But just for those who do not know this, right? The letters Yud He Vav He, if you were to sound them out, right, would come to something like Yahweh or Jehovah, right? That's where those 2 terms come from this sort of mysterious word for God that nobody knows how to pronounce. Only the high priest was supposedly knew how to pronounce this word. So the rabbis said, we're going to use this spelling, Yod He Vav He, in order to indicate that we are speaking about God, but we don't know how to say God's true name. So you just pronounce this word as Adonai, meaning something we're going to get to in a second. So Adonai, Adon means Lord. This is a very interesting thing that we're about to get into because Adonai is not my Lord, it's my Lords, plural. So we're about to get into something that could devolve into its own class, which I would not really be able to teach you because I don't know enough about it to go into more detail on this topic. But there are two terms that I'd like to explain to everybody, or you can participate too, because I don't know everything about this. But there are two terms about ancient religions that we're going to talk about now that we've referred to God in the plural. The first is monolatry. Monolatry is the existence, the acknowledgement of the existence of more than one God, but we are choosing to worship that one God. Second term being henotheism. I might be pronouncing that terribly, henotheism, I don't know. But henotheism is the belief that there is one God who is above all of the other gods and is like the lead God who controls the whole pantheon, or maybe they don't have very much to do with each other, but he's the all-powerful God, even if there exist other lower divinities or divine powers. So it's important to recognize that, okay, yes, the Second Temple era of Judaism and rabbinic era, very long era of Judaism were extremely monotheistic. It's like the main thing that they were trying to push. Obviously, they're just like, Shema, we have one God, that is our God, there's no other God, the first commandment, like, I am your God, right? So that is central to everything we believe. But if we're looking a little bit further back into history, there is very debatable, there is a convincing argument to be made that the early Israelites, the earliest versions of Judaism that we could trace back to First Temple and earlier, believed that there was more than one God. They were not truly monotheistic. Now, of course, there is an argument to be had on both sides of this, but the belief that we have one God that we are praying to, sure, I'm not sure you can really argue with that, but they might have believed in the existence of other gods. So in this, I'm not sure it explains exactly why we were referring to God in the plural, because that is probably just a remnant, like a lost vestige of a previous something. And there are other examples of this. Adonai is one term that is plural, but we often say Adonai Elohim or whatever, or Elohim as one version of referring to God. Elohim is plural gods. So once again, we are referring to God in the plural form, and that could imply just that there are multiple parts to the divine aspect. It could also imply, I'm just looking at the time. Oh, wow, we are so far behind. Holy crap. Okay. It could also imply, and this is my thought, that originally this term was referring to God as in El, the term El meaning God, our God, the supreme God above all the others in their henotheism, like the one God that is above all of other gods, and Asherah. Asherah was the other prime divinity at that time that is shared with some of the other religions of the region, Zoroastrianism, and it's very common in Egypt. There was a version of Asherah. It was the other supreme divinity with God early in the Israelite experience. So my guess is that that's a vestige of Adonai or Elohim is coming from that, and that we were praying originally way back to two gods. Now, that was totally gone by the time we're at the Second Temple. And the Second Temple period, or right before the Second Temple period, there was a ruler called Josiah. And Josiah was the one who, historically speaking, maybe not from anybody who believes that the words of the Torah are literally God's words, word for word, but from a historical perspective, Josiah was the one who wrote the Shema, basically, or at least penned it and put it into Deuteronomy. Like, Deuteronomy is totally separate from the other four books. And from a historical perspective of who we think wrote them. So Deuteronomy was found like hundreds of years later after the other four books of the Torah. And in that book, it was like, oh, wow, we uncovered this book. It's been hidden in my basement for 1,000 years. It's like, okay, probably not. It was probably that there needed to be a reformation of Israel or of the Israelite people to observe a religion in which they only prayed to one God. And the Shema is like the centerpiece of that, and it's in Deuteronomy, but doesn't exist in the other 4 books. So that's where we think that that was sort of his political slogan when he was trying to reform the religion of the country. And then he put it in the 5th book of the Torah, or maybe not him, but a scribe or whoever. And that's where that comes from. Maybe. I can't say anything definitively, obviously. Okay, going through really quickly the rest. So Eloheinu, also, it means our God, but you could make the argument it's coming from Elohim, also a plural of God. And Melech, king, simple, ruler, if you want, or sovereign, if you want to avoid the gendered element. And then Ha'olam. So we've got Baruch, Atah, Adonai, Eloheinu, Melech, Ha'olam. Ha'olam, generally in this context, means the world. Ha meaning the, or the, and Olam meaning world, or universe, let's say. But if we were to go into other prayers, Olam is a very important term because it really can mean universe. It can mean forever. It can mean into infinity. It also has the same root as the word Ne'elam, which means hidden or secret. So there is a thought that the word for Olam really meant, it originally meant everything, but because we know nothing about how the world actually works, that's why it's connected to Ne'elam. It's like the divine will is the only will that can know the world truly. So we're saying, who is the ruler of everything, and we can't understand everything. Like, that's beyond our comprehension. Okay, so we are so far behind. Okay, so let's get into service order. On any given day, like a non-holiday, normal day of the week, there are 3 services. I'm going to start in the order of the day as someone 2,000 years ago would have thought about it. The beginning of the day is the evening. That's why, right, if you're thinking about Hebrew date, it starts when the sun goes down. So let's start with the evening service. The first service is Ma'ariv, or Arvit. 2 different, they're from the same root. They mean the same thing, basically. The coming of evening or the evening, basically, or what those 2 words are. So, Ma'ariv. Ooh, did someone have something to say? Oh, that's how. Okay. So I'm trying to go quickly through this. So Ma'ariv is said to correspond to the evening observance in the Holy Temple. There was an offering, like I said before, there was an offering at every time that there would have been a service. And this Ma'ariv offering would have been at the evening in the temple. So although there were no sacrifices brought at night, any animal parts that were not burned during the day could be offered at night. So that's very confusing, whatever. So there was no sacrifice brought during the evening, but the part that hadn't been offered would be like then additionally offered in the evening. So since it wasn't always necessary, the evening prayer was declared to be optional originally as well. And the Jews long ago accepted it as an obligation to do this prayer service, even though originally it was an optional service. Now, in my opinion, this is why the evening service is entirely silent in a traditional setting, basically. There are a couple of little things that might get said as a community, but there is no repetition. Also, we're going to talk about this when we talk about the Amidah itself, the center of every individual service, but there is, in a more traditional setting, there is a repetition of the Amidah that happens. Everybody would say it by themselves, and then the group would say it together, basically. And in an evening service, that does not occur. And it's partially, in my opinion at least, one, to do with this old tradition that there wouldn't necessarily have been an evening offering, and 2, we're going to get into this a little bit with some of the blessings surrounding the Shema, but the evening service is meant to be shorter because people needed to get home and they were worried about the dark. So they needed to say it quickly and then get home as soon as possible. Another explanation for the Ma'ariv service itself existing is that Ma'ariv corresponds to our patriarch Jacob. And in Genesis 28, it says that when Jacob left his hometown of Beersheba to go to Haran, he met at the place for the sun had set. Now, that's very vague and doesn't say anything about a prayer service, but the Talmud understood this to mean that Jacob went to go pray at night. And thus we have Ma'ariv. Like, that would be the rabbinic explanation of why we have Ma'ariv, not there used to be a sacrifice offered, because they didn't want to have anything to do with the sacrifice. Or even if they acknowledged that the sacrifices existed, they didn't want to be dependent on the sacrifice. They were saying, we operated this way before the sacrifices, even though that's not true, or that's probably not true. All right, so in the morning, similarly, Shacharit was also instituted in part to replace the daily morning temple offering, which there was every day. According to our tradition also, though, similarly, Abraham in Genesis 19 stated, in Genesis 19 it said, Abraham arose early in the morning, which for some reason is interpreted by the rabbis as he went to go pray early in the morning. So it's very possible he did go to pray, but it doesn't say that in the text. That is the rabbis at work. That is how they do everything, basically. And it's really the reason that we're able to, despite the Torah not having any detail of how to, let's say, for example, Torah says, observe Shabbat. What does that mean? It doesn't say anything. So the rabbis had a reason to try to, figure out what a very vague statement meant. They had to figure out what it meant for your life, especially when it was a commandment, like you must observe Shabbat. If we have no idea what that means, of course they had to fill it in. So in this particular case, it's maybe unnecessary to make the connection between Abraham and Shacharit, the morning service, but so it is. Okay, in the afternoon, we have the Mincha service. So let's just recap. In the evening, we have Ma'ariv. In the morning, we have Shacharit. And in the afternoon, we have Mincha. These are the three everyday services. Now, Mincha, same kind of thing. There was an afternoon offering. And the rabbis made a similar connection. The Mincha prayer was originated with Isaac, who went out to converse in the field in the afternoon. So once again, the same thing. They just said Isaac went out into the field in the afternoon. Oh, that must have meant he prayed. Now, to be fair, I think in this particular case, if we were to look at the text, there's more of an argument to be made that that's what he was doing, because in this particular case, there is an internal struggle going on, and he might have gone out into the field to, whether we thought it was think that he was doing or pray, or they're one and the same, I don't know. Then yes, this one makes a little more sense. The others are kind of very vague in the Torah text. All right, I'm trying to go as quickly as possible. Okay, so right, we have our three daily services, evening, morning, afternoon. One of the things that people did to save time, because each of these services is supposed to occur at between 2 points in the day, is that because Mincha can go up to sundown and Ma'ariv can start at sundown, in order to not go to synagogue 3 times a day, because they require a minyan to do the Amidah, 10 people, they would combine Mincha and Ma'ariv services. Your afternoon service would go right into your evening service. Now, the rabbis were not happy about this, actually, and they very strongly discouraged it. But eventually, with it, especially once we're into modern times, that's pretty common. Now, there are still going to be communities that don't do that. And in the Reform world, we don't really do Mincha almost ever anyway. So that doesn't really exist except during the high holidays and on a couple of other occasions that we might just decide it's the afternoon, so we're going to do Mincha instead of Ma'ariv or something like that. But in general, the Reform world does not observe Mincha very often. Okay, and then finally, our last normal service time, I know we were getting a little late, is Musaf. Now, Musaf it literally just means additional. And so Musaf is an additional service that occurred on any holiday, including Shabbat. So on every Shabbat at the Great Temple, there was an additional offering made because it's a special day and there would be one offering made in addition to the normal offerings. And so on Shabbat and on any other Yom Tov, a good day, a holiday, a Yontif, in the very Ashkenazic pronunciation, there would be an extra service. Now, if I remember correctly, we don't do Musaf here. Sorry, at my previous synagogue in New York, we did actually do Musaf, which is highly unusual in the Reform movement, even on a high holiday. In Shabbat, the Reform movement has totally gotten rid of Musaf, but it would come directly after Shacharit, after your morning service. So it's one service, you just add another Amidah on top of your normal Amidah in a morning service. And that would basically, Musaf is as minimal as a service can be. It's basically just another Amidah. Okay, any questions? And then I'm gonna just really quick try to do choreography stuff, and then we'll be done for tonight. I know this is a lot, and I am really sorry. There's just so much to talk about that I can't like be as basic as I want to be. Okay, so this might be the most like practical thing that we're gonna do in the whole time, but let's go through some choreography as it would be done in a normal service. Okay. All right, so all choreography happens while you are standing up. Now, in itself, the concept of am I standing while saying a prayer or am I sitting is a whole debate that lasts hundreds of pages of discourse in the Talmud, basically, of any individual prayer. Should I be standing? Should I be sitting? Now, obviously, the Amidah, which literally means standing, means that you're standing during that prayer or that grouping of blessings. But in pretty much every other case, there's an argument to be had on both sides. The Shema is the most famous debate of this, of where basically Rabbi Hillel said, this is misinterpreted sometimes, but Rabbi Hillel said, you're supposed to, okay, so we are told you say the Shema when you rise, like when you get up in the morning and when you go to sleep, right? So that's when you're supposed to say the Shema. Now, of course, as you know, we say the Shema in our services at synagogue. So the Reform movement has taken that to mean we're going to say the Shema in a morning service, meaning when we get up, and an evening service when we go to bed. Now, we may have gotten up hours earlier or gone to bed hours later, but that's when we're going to say them. In a more observant setting, you would actually say those portions of the service in your own home, and you don't need to say them with the community. That's why the Amidah, that's why at their core, each service is an Amidah, especially in these contexts where there are sections that you would have done at home and that a Reform service is going to incorporate into the service structure because they assume most people don't do those things at home, and we should do them as a community then. Okay, so let's say for the Shema, right, they're basically Rabbi Hillel, whom you may have heard of, would have said, whatever position you find yourself in when you think it's the right moment to do that, when you're getting up or when you're going to sleep, that's the position you should say the Shema in. And Rabbi Shammai said, basically, it says do it when you rise up and when you go to sleep. So in the morning, you should stand up, and when you're going to sleep in the evening, you should do it while you're lying down. The rabbis sort of debate this. There's no real answer provided, basically. You can, like, even in a Reform setting, in my previous synagogue, we always stood when we were saying the Shema. In this synagogue setting, we never stand when we're saying the Shema, basically. So there's a very wide disagreement on this. Okay, let's do some choreography. I'm going to go through everything that I can think of, starting beginning of Friday night and going through the end of Saturday morning as quickly as so we can get through all this. Okay, so Friday night, there is a section, we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but there's a section of the service at the beginning called Kabbalat Shabbat. Kabbalat Shabbat is a Kabbalistic, as you might be able to tell from the name, Kabbalat, is a Kabbalistic addition to the Ma'ariv service for Shabbat, on Friday evenings. And the centerpiece of Kabbalat Shabbat is something called Lecha Dodi, which has 9 verses and Lecha Dodi. It's an acrostic. It spells the name of the person who wrote the poem. Now, Lecha Dodi has a final verse, Boi v'shalom, Ateret ba'ala. I won't say the whole thing, but basically we're saying, this is the culminating moment. Come, Sabbath bride, enter our sanctuary, basically. Now, in Kabbalistic times, let's say about 600 years ago, in Eretz Yisrael, in Sfat, where like a lot of Kabbalistic thought was compiled at that time in that area, the rabbis devised this tradition once this piece was written, Lecha Dodi, where they would go out literally into the field so that they would go farther than they would normally be able to see with the sun setting, so they could get the very last and end of the day, like they would go farther so that they could see the sun setting even farther away than they normally would be able to. And then they would welcome Shabbat in as the sun finally set. Now, in our case, clearly we're not going to run out as a congregation into the middle of the street to find the sun setting, especially because we don't often do it once the sun has set. It's like sometime before or after, who knows, in the Reform world. But in this, we would turn around during the last verse. The rabbi often says, we rise to welcome the Shabbat bride or something of that nature. What we would do is we're facing either east. This is a mixed tradition too, either east, or the rear of the sanctuary. Now, it's usually the rear of the sanctuary. So we would turn around and we face the rear of the sanctuary while we're singing this one verse. Okay, utohola. Sorry. So we would say that, and then as soon as Lachadodi starts again, Lachadodi, or whatever melody we're singing, Lechadodi, we turn back around and we're all facing the bima again. Okay, so that's our first one. Only on Friday nights. It's not pertinent to any other service. When we say Baruch Hu, that is the Baruch Hu, we're going to talk a little bit about this. It's part of Shema U'Virchotecha. The Baruch Hu is the beginning, I'm going so late, is the beginning of every service for the most part. There are so many exceptions, nothing can be stated definitively. Baruch Hu is the beginning of every service in that we are calling all of us to pay attention, basically. We're saying, Baruch Hu et Adonai, we should all be doing the blessing of God right now. So let's do it. So with Baruch Hu et Adonai Hamborach, in my understanding, this is not a knee bow. It says nothing about our knees. So Baruch Hu, we should bless. Now, Baruch Hu, as we talked about before, is same root as Baruch, meaning it actually does have to do with the knees. So you can make an argument in either direction. But if you were looking at an Orthodox Siddur that's telling you what to do choreography-wise, a Siddur meaning a prayer book, it would not say bend your knees. So Baruch Hu, you just bow at the waist, and then you just bow at Baruch Hu, the word Baruch Hu, at Adonai, and then by the time you're done saying Adonai, you would be standing up straight. Now, of course, we're a Reformed community. You can do whatever you want, but I'm trying to tell you can teach what would normally be done, I guess. So Baruch Hu et Adonai Hamborach would generally be, that's the action of Baruch Hu. Now, of course, Baruch Hu, the first line of the Baruch Hu, is only done by the prayer leader. Now, that's something that's not really recognized in most of our community, but only the prayer leader sings Baruch Hu Adonai et Adonai Hamborach, and only the prayer leader does the first bow. Then the congregation responds with Baruch Adonai Hamborach Le'olam Ba'ed, and they would do the bow, Baruch Adonai Hamborach Le'olam Ba'ed. Okay, so that's our first bit of choreography. Right, only the prayer leader says Baruch Hu, then everybody else responds with the next line, Baruch Adonai Hamborach Le'olam Ba'ed, which would mean literally, blessed is God, who is so blessed forever and ever. That's basically the translation of it. Okay, so one explanation though why we do not use knees here, not that this actually explains why we're using knees or not using knees, but the next bow at the beginning of the Amidah, we do Baruch Atah Adonai, meaning knee, waist bend, and up, is that in the Baruch Hu, we're not talking to God, we're talking to ourselves. We say, Baruch Hu et Adonai, you, the community, should engage in this prayer right now. So that's why it's a simpler bow. It's just like, we are doing this prayer, but we are not actually directing this particular prayer at God. We're just sort of, I don't know that there would be a bow exactly. Okay. Yes, if you need to go to the Barry Weiss thing, you should definitely do that or anything else. And it has been a pleasure. And I'm sorry I'm running late on this. Do people want me to finish up this section or should I just start with this next time?
Finish up.
Okay. So Baruch Hu, we have singular waist bow. Then at the beginning of the Amidah, Baruch Atah Adonai. So Atah, right, the you, meaning we are praying directly to God here. And in the Amidah, all of the blessings are directed specifically at God. They all have Atah in them. So in that case, Baruch Atah Adonai, knees, waist, and up. Now, that only happens during the first blessing of the 19 blessings of the Amidah, or 7 if it's a weekday. So we are going to talk about that. There are 19 and 7 blessings depending on the day in the Amidah. Also, it's called Shmona Esrei, which means 18, and yet there are 19 blessings. So that's very confusing. We will talk about that. In this particular case, right, we only do it during Avot ve'imahot. Our mothers and fathers, ancestors section, we do those vows at the beginning of the blessing and at the end of the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu v'imotenu, and at the end, Baruch atah Adonai Magen Abraham Bezrat Sarah. Okay, right. So we only do it there. Now, yes, even some rabbis and cantors are going to bow on the second one. That's not common traditionally, but as I said before, this is minhag. This is not halacha. There's no law about this. So if you did it, it's not like you're damning us, whatever, to never have the Messiah come, which is its whole own thing that we could talk about, Messianic Judaism, and not even the movement Messianic Judaism, but Messiah in relation to Rabbinic Judaism. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Baruch Hu, Avot, Kedusha. Okay, in the Kedusha, now, I sing a couple of different tunes, but we have Kadosh, 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 right? So there are two things involved with this. First, you'll see the one commonality among anybody doing this is Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. Each of them, there are a couple of different versions, either going up, down, up, down, up, down on the Kadosh, or do like a little more like a Kadosh, 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 like a little higher as you're doing each one. Now, both of those come from the fact that that line, Kadosh, 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 is what the angels say in heaven in a prophetic vision, basically, that's had. And so in this particular case, when we say this, we are sort of trying to emulate the angels. And so another tradition that minhag that occurs when doing Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh is that your feet are together, which that one I'm less careful about because you'll see I don't always do that, is because angels theoretically only have one leg. Or specifically, this type of angel only has one leg. So you would put your feet together so that you can more properly emulate the angels there. Kedusha. You'll also see that when I am doing the Kedusha, anytime there is a line that is from the Torah itself, so you have Baruch Kivod Adonai Mimkomo, and Adonai Yimloch Leolam Ba'ed. Those are actual rabbinic, Torah texts that I'll just do a little bop up during those. That is not traditional at all. It's only during Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh in the Kedusha that you would have any sort of choreography. Oh, that's not true. Right before Kadosh, 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 you say, oh crap. 1 second. So sorry. I don't want to get the wording wrong. Oh, the kara ze el ze. Right. Sorry. In the bit of Torah where it says kadosh, 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 it says the kara ze el ze, meaning that the angels are calling one side to another in this heaven setting of sorts. They're calling one to the other, kadosh, kadosh, kadosh. So they're telling each other that God is so holy, basically, in the setting. So when you do kara ze el ze, you sort of give a little bow to each side that the angels are calling to and from. That, right, is minhag. Not everybody does that. Even in an Orthodox setting, that is going to be a little bit inconsistent. But that is fairly common. That one and the kadosh, kadosh, kadosh are the two choreography elements of Kedusha. All right, the end of the Amidah. You might see someone when they're wrapping up the Amidah, they might take a couple steps back. Oh, I forgot to do the very beginning of the Amidah. Wow. Okay, beginning of the Amidah. Adonai sifatai tiftach ufi yagid tehilatecha. So when we're saying these words, there is a tradition, but once again, tradition, that you would take 3 steps back, and then as you're saying the first 3 words of that, Adonai sifatai tiftach, and then as you're saying the next 3, ufi yagid. Oh, sorry. Yes, when you're saying the next 3 words, you would be saying. Taking 3 steps forward. So you're basically like recentering yourself as you are getting into the Amidah, the standing element. I have no idea where that comes from. Couldn't tell you. And it's very much tradition. Once again, like there are plenty of people who are very observant who do not do that, who don't even necessarily say those first 6 words. Now, it's very common that most people would, but it's not like we don't do it at Temple Emanu-El, and we may put that back in, to be fair. But it has not been said in a while here, since I've been here at least. Okay, then the end of the Amidah, you have a similar thing, where sort of maybe you might back out 3 steps or something of that nature, and then maybe give a double bow on the Modim, and then you would be able to sit down because you're done with your Amidah. That is so widely varied in tradition of how people do those bows and when they're doing those bows, which final blessing are they doing? Because there are like 3 different final blessings to the Amidah. We're going to talk about that. It's very confusing in that regard. So there's no consistent element on that front. The consistent ones we have are Baruch Hu, Avot, and Avot, Kedusha with the Kadosh, 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 and the Kara Ze El Ze. But in terms of the end of the Amidah, there's no consistency. And the beginning, yeah, that's fairly common. All right, next one, we have Aleinu. Aleinu is interesting because Aleinu l'shabeach la'adon hakol la'teit gedula. Okay, sorry, that's irrelevant to the text. Ba'anachnu kora'im umishtachavim. So you could interpret those 2 words, kora'im umishtachavim, that's when the bowing would occur, as the same thing. So if you look even in our prayer book, the new prayer book, sorry, the Mishkan Tefillah, it will say at that section, I just want to get you exactly what it says. It says, therefore we bow in awe and thanksgiving before the singular God. But it doesn't say that there are 2 verbs there. There are 2 verbs there. There's koreim umishtachavim. So the real like technical translation of each would be a bend and then a supplication. So yeah, you can take that how you want, and some people will just do just a singular bow. You're like anach ba'anachnu koreim umishtachavim without the knee bend. But the more like literal reason that we do the knee bend and then the waist bend is that there are 2 verbs there, and you're trying to sort of give each verb its kavod, its honor, so that they both are relevant. Okay, so right, so that's why you'll see sort of variation there. Some people might just waist bow over, or very quickly ba'anachnu, knee bend, and then koreim umishtachavim. But like if you'll see that when I'm doing it, I'm trying to do it on the word itself. So koreim, knee bend, and umishtachavim, supplicate. So that's how that works. All right, moving on. We've got Kaddish. Okay, right. So in Kaddish, this is very varied also. So right, at the end of Kaddish, when you do Oseh Shalom, you should have taken 3 steps backwards before the Oseh Shalom, which is the difficult part, because you'll see me doing it in the middle of the verse before that, Yehei Shlama Rabba min Hashemaya, because I'm trying to anticipate that you need to have taken 3 steps and the rabbi speaks quickly and whatever, so that's very difficult. And then Oseh Shalom b'mromav, Hu Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu ve'al Kol Yisrael Aleinu on the other side. That's super varied. There's no consistency in that. Like I was in cantorial school, I just saw how people did it and chose the one that I wanted to do, basically. So that one is less codified as well. And yeah, and we have covered all of the major choreography of service. This is a lot, and I'm really sorry that it's so rushed. But I really appreciate everybody sticking with me who stuck out past 7 o'clock. Any questions?
Cantor, I have a question. It's really not about the choreography, though, but I'm curious why on Friday nights we don't open the Ark at all anymore.
Because the rabbi didn't want to open the Ark. That's about as simple as I can give it. Yes, we probably should open the Ark. That's my thought, at least, but I'm not in charge.
Okay. I mean, there's not a requirement that during the, I don't know what it's called. the Lenu or whatever it is, when you do that prayer, it shouldn't be open?
It really probably should be. My guess is there's no halakha about that, meaning like law about it, because there really isn't very much halakha about anything related to any of this kind of stuff. But it's unusual. We should definitely have the Ark open. I will probably bring this up at some point again about the Ark being open, but
I mean, I just think,
like it being open.
I think it's a nice, I grew up with that, and I just think it's a nice thing that sometime during that service, the Ark should be open. I mean, I've been places before where they have kind of a curtain over the Ark, so it's kind of always open. So maybe
Right.
they could say that's why it's open. But
I mean, in my previous synagogue, we had the curtain. So there were the big doors and there was the curtain. So when services were happening, the curtain might be closed, but the doors are open. But we, even for Elenu or for Torah service or for whatever, we would open the curtain too. So yeah, I think we should have the Ark open.
well, I'll give you a vote, one vote. I'll add to your vote, I should say.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the support.
I think I've mentioned it to Adam before.
I'm guessing that he's heard it from a couple of people, but I could bring that up again. Yeah, David.
David, you're muted.
David.
David, you're muted.
Cantor Wittner, you mentioned something very interesting tonight, if you could just touch on it. You said more important than there were rabbis, there were prayer leaders. So do I take it that really more than laws, prayers come first? Is that your feeling, that almost more than laws, that we should pray, our prayers are first and really more important than maybe the laws that we live? Could you just expound on that for a second, Cantor?
Yeah, so no, I would not say that that's what the rabbis meant there.
Okay.
I would say that what it really meant is having someone to lead you in a beautiful Havana inducing, like that's going to bring out all the feelings and the thoughts and the love that you have for life and God and all that, that having someone who can do that for you and for the community and properly lead a service in that way is more important than having a rabbi who has been ordained a rabbi. Because what they were really saying is, most likely you will have someone in your community or a group of people in your community who are fairly learned about rabbinic law. Whether they're rabbis or not, they're going to be knowledgeable enough to answer your questions when you have questions. And if they're not, there should be someone that you can send out a letter to and they can answer your question about how to live your life. But they were saying, you know, you're not going to have a cantor travel to your town every week or something, or someone who can lead it beautifully. All they meant by cantor, because it wasn't an ordained position at the time, was just who can lead a service nicely.
Thank you.
Yes, of course. Happy to take more questions. Also, if people are like just staying on, I'm happy to answer more questions, but we could do that at the end of the next time. Like questions that people pose when you're signing up. I know we've lost a bunch of people though, so we might want to hold off to next time. All right, I think we're gonna call it an evening then, and next week we'll pick it up with a little bit of rabbinic and Chazal history.
Thank you so much. I learned so much already.
Thank you,
Oh, my
Cantor.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Very helpful.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Sure.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Good night.